The cabin already felt too small before Brandon even realized something was wrong. The air carried that familiar mix of recycled oxygen, faint coffee, and overheated plastic, and the steady thud of overhead bins closing echoed like a ticking clock. People were still boarding, dragging roller bags down the aisle, apologizing without meaning it. Brandon sat in his assigned seat, shoulders tight, backpack wedged under his legs, eyes half on his phone and half on the slow-moving chaos around him. He just wanted the flight to take off on time. He just wanted to go home. That was when the voice cut through the noise. "I'm not moving my bag." It wasn't loud yet, but it was sharp, edged with certainty. Brandon looked up instinctively. 2 rows ahead, a woman was stretched across 2 seats like she'd claimed territory. One arm rested on the armrest, the other draped possessively over a large designer purse placed squarely in the middle of the second seat. Her legs were angled outward, blocking the aisle seat beside her. She looked around 40, immaculately put together, hair styled just enough to look effortless, lips pressed into a thin line that dared anyone to challenge her. A flight attendant stood beside her, posture polite but rigid. "Ma'am, that seat is assigned to another passenger." The woman didn't look at her. "I understand that," she said coolly, "but I need the space." Brandon felt a faint tightening in his chest. He glanced down at his boarding pass, then back at the row number above the seats. His stomach dropped. The aisle seat next to her. His seat. The line of passengers behind him slowed. Someone bumped his shoulder. The plane seemed to hold its breath. The flight attendant tried again, still calm. "If you've purchased 2 seats, I'll need to see the confirmation." The woman finally turned her head, just enough to make eye contact. Her expression was a practiced mix of annoyance and disbelief, like the request itself was offensive. "I already explained this. I paid for my ticket. I'm sitting here." Brandon swallowed. He didn't want to be involved. He hated scenes, hated the way eyes lingered, hated the pressure of public conflict. Still, he stood, shifting into the aisle, boarding pass in hand. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice even. "I think that's my seat." The woman looked him up and down slowly, as if evaluating whether he was worth acknowledging. "No," she said flatly. "It's not." Brandon blinked. "It says 18C, he replied, holding up the pass. "That's the aisle." She scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "Then you can talk to them," she said, jerking her chin toward the flight attendant. "Because I'm not moving." A few nearby passengers pretended to focus on their phones, but Brandon could feel their attention, like heat on his skin. His face warmed despite himself. "I'm not trying to cause a problem," he said. "I just want my seat." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "Of course you do." The flight attendant stepped slightly between them, her tone still professional but firmer now. "Ma'am, unless you've purchased an additional seat, you'll need to clear that space." "I was told this wouldn't be an issue," the woman snapped. "By whom?" the attendant asked. "Someone at the gate," she said immediately. "Too quickly. I explained everything. They said it was fine." Brandon noticed the attendant's jaw tighten, just a fraction. "I'll need to confirm that." The woman crossed her arms. "Go ahead." The line of passengers had stopped entirely now. A man behind Brandon sighed loudly. Somewhere farther back, a child began to cry. Brandon felt the minutes slipping away, the invisible clock counting down to a delayed departure, and with it, the rising irritation of everyone trapped inside the aluminum tube. The flight attendant stepped away to speak into her headset. Brandon remained standing, unsure what to do with his hands. The woman leaned back, reclaiming her space, her purse still firmly planted on the seat that should have been his. She glanced at him sideways. "You could have just picked another seat," she said. "There aren't any," Brandon replied. "That's not my problem." He took a slow breath. "Look, I'm sure we can figure this out." She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "Men always say that when they don't get their way." Brandon stiffened. "This isn't about getting my way." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Then why are you standing here bothering me?" Before he could answer, the flight attendant returned, accompanied by another crew member. The second attendant was older, her movements more deliberate, authority radiating from her calm presence. "Ma'am," she said, "we need you to free up the seat immediately." The woman's posture shifted. She straightened, her voice rising just enough to carry. "I don't appreciate being ganged up on. I told your colleague I need the space. I have anxiety. Being crowded makes it hard for me to breathe." A murmur rippled through the nearby rows. Brandon felt a flicker of doubt, then frustration. If that were true, why not mention it earlier? Why lie about buying the seat? The older attendant nodded slowly. "I understand, but unless you've purchased an extra seat or have documentation, we can't accommodate that request." The woman's eyes flashed. "So you're siding with him?" "We're enforcing policy," the attendant replied. The woman turned fully toward Brandon now, her voice louder. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this? Over a seat?" Brandon felt every gaze lock onto him. His pulse thudded in his ears. "I paid for it," he said quietly. "Just like you." She shook her head, lips curling. "Unbelievable." The attendants exchanged a brief look. The older one spoke into her headset, her tone clipped. Brandon caught fragments of words. "Supervisor. Boarding delay." The woman smirked, settling back into her seat as if she'd won. She adjusted her purse deliberately, spreading it wider. Brandon remained standing in the aisle, trapped between forward motion and retreat, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. The plane was silent now, save for the low hum of systems and the impatient shuffle of feet. Somewhere behind him, someone muttered, "Come on." Brandon exhaled slowly, a realization settling in his chest. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology and a moved bag. The woman wasn't confused or mistaken. She was daring someone to challenge her, confident that discomfort and delay would force everyone else to back down first. As the call light chimed softly overhead and footsteps approached from the front of the cabin, Brandon stared at the empty space beside her and understood that this small, ordinary seat had just become something else entirely. Footsteps approached from the front of the cabin, measured and unhurried, and the older flight attendant returned with a supervisor beside her. He was tall, gray at the temples, and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to ending arguments without raising his voice. Brandon stepped aside to let them pass, heart thumping, while Amanda remained seated, chin lifted, arms crossed like a barricade. The supervisor glanced at the empty aisle seat, then at Brandon's boarding pass, then finally at Amanda, his expression neutral but attentive. Around them, the cabin felt suspended in uneasy silence, waiting for judgment. The supervisor spoke softly, but the authority in his tone carried farther than shouting ever could. He explained the policy clearly, without accusation, stating that one ticket entitled one seat and nothing more. Amanda interrupted twice, each time louder, insisting she had been promised accommodation, insisting she was being targeted. Brandon watched the exchange like someone observing a storm from inside a locked car, powerless but alert. He noticed the supervisor never raised his voice, never reacted, simply repeated the rule until Amanda's words began to sound hollow. Passengers nearby leaned closer, unwilling witnesses to the standoff, growing tense together. Amanda's face shifted as the conversation dragged on, irritation giving way to something sharper and more dangerous. She accused the crew of discrimination, of poor customer service, of ruining her trip before it even began. Her voice carried now, echoing against the curved walls of the cabin, and Brandon felt his shoulders tighten with every accusation. He wanted to disappear into the seat that wasn't even his yet, but the attention pinned him in place, a silent participant in her performance. Several passengers exchanged looks, annoyance mixing with discomfort and growing impatience, as minutes slipped away, relentlessly overhead unnoticed entirely. The supervisor listened until she finished, then shook his head slowly. He told her again that unless she vacated the seat, boarding could not continue. That single statement changed the air. A ripple of frustration spread through the rows behind Brandon, audible sighs and muttered complaints breaking the earlier silence. Amanda sensed it too, and her posture stiffened. She looked around, as if searching for allies, then settled her gaze back on Brandon, resentment hardening into something personal. Her confidence now depended on everyone else backing down first, and she knew it without admitting fear crept closer each second passing. Brandon felt the moment shift inside himself, a quiet recalibration. Arguing hadn't helped. Reason hadn't helped. He realized Amanda wasn't trying to win fairly. She was trying to exhaust everyone else into surrender. He studied her more carefully now, noticing how often her eyes flicked toward nearby phones, how her voice changed when she realized she had an audience. She wanted attention, but only on her terms. The thoughts settled heavily, but with it came a thin, steady resolve. He decided to stop pushing and start letting her speak, because every word she chose only deepened the hole beneath her. The supervisor stepped aside to speak quietly into his radio, his back turned just enough to suggest escalation. Amanda noticed and scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. She muttered something about incompetence, loud enough to be heard. Brandon remained still, his expression neutral, though his pulse hammered. He could feel the collective patience of the cabin thinning, each second stretching tighter than the last. Somewhere overhead, the boarding music looped again, cheerful and painfully out of place. A delay was no longer a possibility. It was becoming inevitable, and everyone present knew exactly who was responsible for causing it now publicly. Amanda shifted tactics, her voice softening abruptly as she addressed the supervisor again. She spoke of stress, of a long week, of how unfair the world had been to her lately. The change was transparent, but she leaned into it, eyes glossy, shoulders slumped. Brandon watched carefully, noting how quickly the performance cracked when the supervisor didn't react. The sympathy she expected never arrived, and the silence that followed felt heavier than her earlier shouting. Several passengers crossed their arms, no longer hiding their irritation, as time slipped away, flights waiting, connections threatened, patience evaporating visibly row by row now. The supervisor straightened and made a decision. He informed Amanda that if she refused to comply, airport security would be contacted. The word landed like a dropped tray. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She laughed too quickly, insisting they wouldn't dare over something so small. Brandon sensed the shift immediately, the balance tipping at last. This was no longer a bluff. It was a line clearly drawn, and Amanda was standing directly on it. Her eyes darted again toward watching passengers, calculating consequences she had never expected to face in such a public confined place before today ever. Brandon finally spoke again, his voice calm and deliberate. He told her she could still sit, that this didn't need to get worse. It wasn't a threat or a plea, just a statement of fact. Amanda stared at him, surprised, then scoffed, accusing him of enjoying the attention. He didn't respond. He simply waited, letting the quiet stretch. The supervisor watched her closely, patience thinning. Decision already made. Every second amplified the consequences she was trying to ignore, while the cabin seemed to lean forward, collectively anticipating what would happen next inevitably soon enough now, without anyone blinking or intervening. The supervisor turned away and spoke into his radio once more, this time without lowering his voice. Amanda stiffened, realizing the point of no return had arrived. Her smile vanished, replaced by tight disbelief. Brandon felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that came when uncertainty finally collapsed into inevitability. The cabin waited, suspended between departure and delay, between cooperation and consequence, as footsteps sounded faintly from the jet bridge. Amanda opened her mouth, preparing one last argument, and the section ends. But no sound came, only realization dawning that control had finally slipped from her grasp completely. The supervisor lowered his radio and turned back toward Amanda, his expression unreadable. Brandon sensed the final outcome forming, like thunder before a storm breaks. Amanda glanced toward the aisle, toward the exit, as if measuring distance and options. Her earlier bravado felt distant now, replaced by calculation. Around them, passengers sat unnaturally still, aware they were witnessing a moment that would decide whether this flight left on time or unraveled completely. The tension pressed down, heavy and unavoidable, filling every breath, until even the hum of engines seemed to pause in anticipation of what came next for everyone involved. Amanda finally shifted in her seat, fingers tightening around her purse strap. She looked at Brandon again, searching for something she could use, some weakness or hesitation. She found none. His calm unsettled her more than anger ever could. The supervisor took a step closer, not threatening, just present. The message was clear without being spoken. The rules had not bent, and the consequences were already moving toward her. Somewhere beyond the cabin door, help was already on its way, and Amanda sensed it, heart pounding, options narrowing, confidence draining by the second, without mercy now fully exposed publicly. Brandon leaned back slightly, finally allowing himself a breath. Whatever happened next was no longer in his hands. Amanda's jaw tightened as distant footsteps grew louder, unmistakable now. The supervisor nodded once, as if confirming a silent decision. The cabin remained frozen, eyes forward, ears straining. In that suspended moment, with the aisle still blocked and the door still open, it became clear that this confrontation was about to reach its point of no return. No one spoke, and everyone understood something irreversible was about to happen right there, between Rose, rules, and consequences, with Amanda finally out of moves. Two uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane with quiet efficiency, their presence instantly changing the temperature of the cabin. They didn't rush or raise their voices. They didn't need to. Authority followed them naturally, filling the aisle as they paused just behind the supervisor. Amanda noticed them immediately. Her grip tightened on her purse, knuckles whitening, eyes darting from one face to another, as if searching for a crack in the moment she could slip through. The supervisor spoke first, calmly explaining the situation in concise terms, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation or drama. Amanda tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding, that she was being unfairly singled out, that this had all gone too far. One officer listened patiently, while the other glanced at the empty aisle seat, then at Brandon standing beside it. Brandon met his eyes briefly, offering nothing but a quiet nod. He felt strangely detached, as if watching events unfold through glass. The officers asked Amanda to step off the aircraft so the matter could be resolved at the gate. The request was polite, final, and non-negotiable. "No," Amanda said, louder than she intended. The word echoed, brittle and desperate. She clutched the armrest as if it might anchor her there. "I'm not going anywhere." The supervisor's expression hardened just enough to be noticeable. He explained that refusal would escalate the situation further, potentially resulting in her removal from the flight entirely. Amanda's confidence cracked. She stood abruptly, knocking her purse to the floor, the contents spilling messily into the aisle. Lipstick rolled toward Brandon's shoe. For a split second, she looked embarrassed, truly embarrassed, and then anger surged to cover it. She accused the crew of humiliating her, accused Brandon of provoking the entire ordeal, accused everyone of enjoying her discomfort. Passengers no longer pretended not to watch. Heads turned openly now. Someone whispered, "Finally." Another shook their head. The officers waited unmoved, while Amanda gathered her belongings with shaking hands. Her movements were sharp, aggressive, as if speed might restore control. When she straightened, one officer gestured gently toward the aisle. Amanda hesitated, then stepped forward, chin high, eyes burning with resentment. As she passed Brandon, she hissed something under her breath, but he didn't respond. Silence was his answer, and it seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could have. They escorted her down the aisle, past rows of watching passengers, past the place where her authority had dissolved into consequence. The sound of her heels against the floor faded toward the exit. The cabin exhaled collectively, a release so palpable Brandon felt it in his chest. The supervisor apologized briefly for the delay, thanked everyone for their patience, and signaled for boarding to resume. The security officers exited, and the door remained open only a moment longer before being sealed shut with a final, reassuring thud. Brandon finally sat down. The seat was unremarkable, narrow and stiff, but it felt earned. He adjusted his backpack beneath the seat in front of him, buckled in, and leaned back. A flight attendant stopped beside him, offering a quiet smile and a simple thank you. He nodded, unsure what to say. Across the aisle, A man gave him a thumbs up before returning to his book. Someone behind him muttered, "Worth the wait." Brandon couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his mouth. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and apologetic, explaining the delay without naming names. The plane began to move, a gentle lurch followed by steady motion as it pushed back from the gate. Brandon watched the terminal slide past his window, lights blurring slightly as the engines hummed to life. Tension drained from his shoulders, leaving only fatigue and a quiet sense of closure. The moment was over. The conflict had burned itself out, leaving behind order and forward motion. As the plane taxied, Brandon reflected on how close he'd come to giving up, to letting discomfort win simply to avoid confrontation. He hadn't sought a victory, hadn't wanted an audience or applause. All he'd wanted was what he paid for and a boundary respected. The irony wasn't lost on him that by staying calm and stepping back, he'd allowed Amanda's behavior to speak for itself. Her own insistence had written the ending. He felt no triumph, only a steady satisfaction that fairness, at least this time, had prevailed. Somewhere back at the gate, Amanda was dealing with the fallout. Brandon didn't know the details, but he could imagine the consequences. A missed flight, a notation in her record, perhaps a temporary ban. Consequences proportionate to choices. The thought didn't bring him joy, but it didn't bring guilt either. Actions had led directly to outcomes, visible and unavoidable. The system hadn't bent, and in its rigidity, it had protected everyone else trapped in that metal tube waiting to leave the ground. The plane reached the runway and paused. Engines roared, pressing Brandon into his seat as acceleration surged forward. He focused on the sensation, the familiar pull, the moment when gravity loosened its grip and the ground fell away. The cabin grew quiet again, not tense this time, but peaceful. As they climbed, clouds swallowed the view outside, white and endless. Brandon closed his eyes briefly, breathing evenly, letting the last of the stress dissolve completely. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin settled into routine, trays lowered, conversations resumed, screens flickered on. Life continued, uninterrupted now. Brandon sipped water and stared out the window, thinking about how small moments could swell into defining ones under the right pressure. He wondered if Amanda would learn anything from the experience or if she would rewrite it later, casting herself as the victim. He suspected the latter. Some people didn't change. They collided with boundaries and blamed the wall. A flight attendant passed again, offering snacks. Brandon accepted with a polite thanks. Normalcy felt almost surreal after the earlier chaos, but it was welcome. He glanced at the empty middle seat across the aisle, now occupied by another passenger who had boarded late, unaware of the drama that had unfolded minutes earlier. The story was already becoming history, filed away, its impact lingering only for those who'd witnessed it firsthand. As the flight carried them farther from the airport, Brandon felt lighter, not because he'd won something, but because he hadn't lost himself to anger or fear. He'd stayed present, steady, and in doing so, allowed accountability to do its work. He looked forward, toward home, toward the quiet certainty that some lines, once held, changed the course of things more than shouting ever could. The plane droned steadily through the sky, carrying everyone onward, while somewhere behind them, a lesson lingered unfinished, waiting to be understood.